Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the government is to appoint a free speech champion for English universities as part of their pledge to protect academic freedom and free speech. Visiting speakers who get no platform will be able to sue universities for compensation, while student unions will also have to ensure that their members have the right to free speech. All this, say critics, is fighting a phantom threat. Is this cancel culture in full voice? Students at University College London disrupting a debate featuring the outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins. In recent years, high-profile speakers from across the political divide have been subject to deplatforming and student protests. This is Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg, before he became leader of the House of Commons, trying to address students at the University of West England 3 years ago. Mass protesters hurled abuse and tried to disrupt the event before they were thrown out. More recently, an appearance by Donald Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, at an Oxford University debate drew hundreds of student protesters. But where are the limits? Former Home Secretary Amber Rudd was deplatformed at the same university just 30 minutes before she was due to appear. And in December, Cambridge University stoked discontent with proposals to ensure differing views were treated respectfully, an approach derided as muddled by alumnus Stephen Fry. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has now said that he wants to ensure free speech on campus under the threat of a fine. But if a problem really does exist, is his approach the best way to solve it? Now, we were hoping to speak to the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, tonight about his moves to defend free speech on the university campuses, but he's turned down our request, as he has done for 18 months now. We would very much like to invite Mr. Williamson to come and discuss, quote, unacceptable silencing and censoring, end quote, which he claims is happening in universities, in an article today in the Daily Telegraph. Well, earlier I spoke to journalist Peter Hitchens, who claims that he's been cancelled from university events, and the writer Nels Abbey, whose novel Think Like a White Man highlights issues around racism in the UK. Peter Hitchens, you've been cancelled twice, if I'm correct, once by the University of Liverpool and once by Portsmouth University. So do you applaud what the government is trying to do today?
Well, I don't applaud what the government's doing. First of all, I wasn't going to cancelled by Liverpool. It's just I refused to undergo the interrogation and form filling that they demanded before I was allowed to speak, and in fact ended up speaking rather pleasingly in the open air on Hope Street between the two cathedrals. So I don't object to that particularly. It was a good demonstration of how freedom can be maintained. Portsmouth, yes, I was cancelled. I don't think that the government has any serious intention of doing anything about this at all. I don't think there's any instinct in this government for freedom of speech at all. But I think they know what plays well with parts of their core voter base, and they think this is a good thing to pursue. But I wouldn't trust them an inch with freedom of speech.
Nels Abbey, do you agree with Peter Hitchens on this one? Or not?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I'm inclined to agree. I don't trust this government with freedom of speech. In fact, the concept of a freedom of speech regulator sounds like a comedic oxymoron that someone like myself would come up with. It doesn't make any sense. As Peter pointed out, it plays well to their core audience, which predominantly appears to be, the government appears to be governing in the interest of older men who are wondering why their grandchildren are not as racist as they are.
Do you still agree with Nels Abbey, Peter Hitchens?
I think the most profound issue is that we are moving away from a society which actually believed quite strongly in liberty of speech and thought to one which doesn't, a society which, in my view, is just a simple result of the collapse of the Protestant Christianity, which was the main ideology, if you like, of the country after 1688, and we're moving towards an egalitarian utopianism, which doesn't place the same value on freedom.
Judging from the expression on your face, Nels Abbey, I think we're finally getting a bit of traction between you and Peter Hitchens.
I'm sure me and Peter and I agree on many different things. The reality of the matter of this, and I think Peter should be used to it now as a man of words, that I think it was Orwell who pointed out that every man and woman of words should be used to one thing, which is being ignored. I think we have a red herring on our hands right here. I don't feel that we have a freedom of speech situation in this country. I feel there's been no bigger beneficiary of freedom of speech in this country. And by freedom of speech in this situation, I'm using it as a synonym for bigoted speech, which is where the argument really is that we're having right now. There's been no bigger beneficiary of it than the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson. Vicious words, vicious articles and words or so against minorities is in part what created his political popularity. And so the very concept of it, I do think there's some concerns here and there, but this hysteria that would actually give rise to the need to something like a council culture champion or a freedom of speech champion on universities is completely unneeded, and it's a red herring.
Nels Abbey, is the problem with cancel culture is that you can cancel the individual performance, but you can't cancel the ideas. And the only way you can really challenge those ideas is to challenge them, you know, in a free arena of free speech.
There is a free arena of free speech. I think that if we uphold one or two extreme incidences where things have gone horrifically bad as indicative of what's happening across the board, we'll get a distorted picture. What we actually do have on campuses, and everywhere, since I've written my book, so I've been invited to campuses left, right, and centre. I've been challenged robustly. I've been panelled alongside people who I would consider to be horrendous people. But we have the speech, we have the dirty arguments, and we let the battle of ideas commence. That is what happens. Even the government's own report, a parliamentary report in 2018, found that this was not the issue that was being made out to be, in particular, the right-wing press.
Peter Hitchens, it's all exaggerated.
I mean, I don't quite what exaggeration would be. If it happens at all, it's bad. Surely, if we believe in freedom of speech, nobody should be prevented from speaking unless they're actually inciting violence or doing something equally revolting. But the fact is that the people who are cancelling actually think their opponents are bad. Not just wrong, but bad. And as a result, they don't want them physically present. And this is a huge shift from the old belief where we actually allowed people to say things we disagreed with and then argued with them and tried to beat them in argument. Now you're actually bad because you oppose some sort of utopian formula which the consensus supports, and you become unacceptable as a person.
Racists and sexists should be cancelled, Peter Hitchens?
I would think it would be much better if people are bigoted. And I once went to a debate about Jean-Marie Le Pen in Cambridge for this reason. If they're bigoted, to argue against their bigotry and show it to be such. I think that's always been a far better response than banning people. I think there are limits to everything, but they're pretty far away from just cancelling people because you don't like the look of them.
Isn't this issue just far too simple for people in politics, certainly on the right of politics, to kind of turn into something enormously important? It's a wedge issue, as they say in America.
No, I think that something very important is happening to our society. I think it's been growing a great deal, particularly in the past 10 years. It was happening long before, and that we are discovering, anybody who takes part in serious arguments is discovering that there are limits on what you can say, and they're getting tighter and tighter all the time. I find that frightening, having grown up in a society that was largely free, and having lived in and visited a lot of societies which are not. I think the freedoms of speech, thought and assembly are absolutely crucial to the maintenance of civilization and to the prevention of tyranny. And if you let go of them, even when it's just a cloud no bigger than a man's hand, as you might say it was now, then you'll find it grows very rapidly into something else. I feel a strong sense, and have during the COVID era, a strong sense of a growing intolerance of any kind of dissent. And as I say, of a loathing of the people who express it, not just of the dissent itself, but of the people who express it, which seems to me to be the first steps towards totalitarianism, which we are now taking.
Nels Abbey, just a final word from you. A question, actually. Why is the Labour Party not picking up this particular cause?
It doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make much sense to me. I think Labour's chasing a vote that I don't think they're likely to actually get. I think Labour should be a lot more robust on a lot of issues, but in particular, as far as the culture war situation is concerned, I think Labour's probably accepted that they're not going to win it. It might be smart politics. It might be good for the Labour Party to keep their mouth shut about it, but it's bad for Britain.
Going to leave it there. Peter Hitchens, Nels Abbey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, is this the time to debate free speech on campus? The government believes so, and today announced plans for a free speech champion. It's also proposing universities will be required by law to promote diversity of views. Some universities and student groups think the threat to free speech on campus has been overblown and is a side issue compared to the struggles they're having with learning and teaching during the pandemic. So who's right in the campus culture war? Arguments about free speech at Britain's universities aren't new. It's more than 5 years since a petition called for Germaine Greer to be disinvited from a speech at Cardiff University. Her fellow feminists Linda Bellos and Selina Todd have been no-platformed, accused of being transphobic. Amber Rudd said she'd had an invitation to speak to an Oxford University society withdrawn half an hour before she was due to appear, called into question for her role in the Windrush scandal while Home Secretary. Each time it's caused a media storm, with commentators accusing students of shutting down debate and compromising academic and democratic values. Here's Jacob Rees-Mogg being accosted as he arrived for a speech at the University of the West of England in 2018. Defenders of no platforming and trigger warnings say it's about creating a safe space where all can feel welcome. So can and should the government step in to defend free speech on campus? Today, the Education Secretary announced he plans to, saying he was deeply worried about the chilling effect of silencing and censoring. Critics question the timing of the announcement during a pandemic. They also point out the irony of a so-called free speech champion clamping down on universities, with powers to fine those that don't come up to scratch. Universities are worried about the implications for their autonomy. The National Union of Students says there's no evidence of a freedom of expression crisis on campus. Williamson thinks there is, and that he can use the law to do something about it. But he's also sending a message to universities, students and voters that the government has taken a side in this particular front of the culture war. Well, I'm joined now by Hilary Jebi Ababia, the NUS Vice President, and Selina Todd, who's Professor of Modern History at the University of Oxford. And Selina Todd, let's start with you. In essence, do you think there is a problem with free speech on campus?
Yes, I think there's a very big problem with free speech on campus. You mentioned in your trail there that I've been no-platformed for my feminist views. It's not just about no-platforming. Prominent individuals like me get no-platformed, but there's a culture of fear within our universities, particularly among feminists and some other groups. I've seen it myself. Members of staff refuse to debate my views with me. I've been subject to staff and student complaints about recent research that I led into the reasons why we should collect data on sex in the UK census. It just goes on. And the thing is that I'm in a very privileged position. I'm professor at an elite university, and yet my employer has never put out an unequivocal statement of support for me. The position for casualised staff and for students is far worse. And the idea that there's no problem is a nonsense. Just last week, a new website called GC Academia Network was set up. I don't know the founders, but what I do know is that in just a few days, they've had 70 anonymous testimonials put on their website by staff and students who have similar views to myself, who say that they've been frozen out of professional networks, that they're frightened to teach their subject, that they're constantly made aware that there will be complaints made against them. And universities simply are not upholding freedom to debate.
And Hilary, I'm assuming you disagree with that, but do you think that there is a problem along the lines that Selina Todd is outlining?
So what we found is that there's no actual clear evidence that there is a freedom of speech crisis on campus. And actually, what we're seeing is that, for example, in December 2020, we surveyed and we saw that 61 student unions were surveyed. And of those 61 student unions, 6 out of almost 10,000 events were cancelled. And those were mainly due to administrative problems as opposed to a block on freedom of speech. And I think it's important to note that universities and student unions are really committed to upholding and promoting freedom of speech. And actually, what the focus needs to be on is championing and amplifying the procedures that are in place that are already robust in maintaining, promoting and protecting freedom of speech for all.
And Selina Todd, I saw you shaking your head there. You don't agree with that?
I don't agree at all. Part of the problem with surveying student unions is that what's really worrying is that the participation in student unions is very, very low in universities. And when one speaks to students or students contact us as they contact me, one of the things that they say is that particularly at the moment, they feel very intimidated by the activists who run student unions. They're told from a very early stage in their studies that they simply cannot take part if they don't hold certain views. There's a real kind of atmosphere of intolerance. It's also not the case that at the moment student unions are legally obliged to uphold freedom of speech. And I appreciate that no platforming is something which is quite extreme and which doesn't happen on a very regular basis. But the fact is, it's about the everyday culture in our universities and in our student unions. And what I see at Oxford and further afield is a constant trying to clamp down on debate. Just last week, I launched a new book, A History of Social Mobility, that has nothing to do with the issue that some trans activists claim to hold against me. It was attended by John McDonnell, who's hardly a reactionary. Oxford University Student Labour Club took to social media to denounce me, to call on John McDonnell to pull out, tried to disrupt my book launch, tried to disrupt a university event, simply because they say that my views actively harm people. That's what there's no evidence of. We have no evidence that hearing robust debate is something which is harmful. In fact, I would argue it's the job of universities. We are educating the next generation of citizens. And if we are going to live in an active democracy, people have to get used to hearing and evaluating and critiquing, yes, points of view different from their own.
So, Hilary, let's just come back to you. No platforming may be one thing. Selina's talking about a culture of fear in universities. And I wonder, this is about sort of people self-censoring in a sense, that there's this sort of silence around issues that are part of this culture war. So it ends up with students, lecturers, whoever it might be, not saying enough, not feeling able to say what they want to say.
So to be clear, on that student union point, I know, and I've personally worked in student unions, and that is my job. I've seen that student unions have been so committed and so proactive in making sure that everybody is able to speak at events and hold events that express all sorts of opinions. And actually, I think what's really important is that we're not seeing a censorship of people from the wider student population. What we're actually seeing is marginalized students or marginalized groups such as Muslim communities are feeling afraid to share their political views because of policies like Prevent, because of policies that continue to make them feel fearful of being able to have their freedom of speech protected and upheld as much as it is for the wider student population. So I think it's a complete mischaracterization and conflation of what is a very baseless, if I'm going to be quite frank, issue of freedom of speech on campus, where universities and student unions are completely committed to continuing to make sure their policies are robust and all students are able to freely express and speak on their opinions, and do that in a way that is inclusive and open for all students to be able to enjoy that right and that fundamental part of being in society.
And Selina, you were nodding earlier, I'd be interested in why, but also there is a point, isn't there, that there's a difference between universities standing up for free speech and the government legislating about it. I mean, that's the sort of difference. It feels, is it Orwellian in a sense that the government is stepping in to legislate on this?
I'm very uneasy about it, and a few years ago I would have strongly opposed it. I have to say that I'm very sceptical of the idea of a free speech champion or czar. I think those positions never really tend to do much good. However, as I say, at the moment, we are in a position where student unions are not legally obliged, as universities are, to uphold freedom of debate. And I don't see any harm in legislation taking place there. I was nodding earlier because I absolutely agree with the point that your other speaker made about Prevent. The government is, on the one hand, upholding policies like Prevent, which potentially can clamp down on freedom to debate. And yes, I think if you're going to champion freedom to debate, which the government claims to be doing, it might be better to actually engage in reasoned debate with these bodies, universities and student unions, before seeking legislation. However, it is the case that last year I was no-platformed in the same week as Amber Rudd. And I know that the government at that point told universities to get their houses in order, and nothing has been done. I've spoken to my own university about the fact that in a marketplace, universities want to stand out. and they see one way of standing out as being liberal and progressive. So they tend to buy into schemes such as the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme. Stonewall is a lobby group, and its policies are about clamping down on free speech and saying that certain legal views cannot be expressed because they constitute harassment.
And I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we're actually about to run out of time on the programme, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. Thank you.